This is MSNBC Convention Night coverage from the Wigwam in Chicago. I'm Mika Brzezinski. We're on the line with our floor reporter, Martin Buckman. Marty, what's going on down there?
Hey, Mika. I bet you can hardly hear me because of those Lincoln people in the background. They're starting to realize as this first ballot's going on that Seward might not make it to that magic 233. Seward's problem started when the vote started geographically with New England. Seward was expecting to take a clean sweep through New England, but stragglers started to leave the Seward camp from Massachusetts, from New Hampshire. Vermont went to its favorite son, Jacob Comer. All right, the balloting's moved on. Oh, what? I'm hearing something. Virginia. Mika, Virginia just went Lincoln. And, Maryland and Delaware, they're going Bates. Bates is out of the picture. Doesn't look like Seward's going to make it to the magic 233. But Lincoln's got to make it to 100. Key to that strategy are locking up the votes from Illinois and Indiana. And he's been working on that for a couple of years. The treasure trove, the real key though, later, maybe if it gets to the second ballot, will be Ohio and Pennsylvania. Chase, the favorite son from Ohio, he's losing control over his own state. In Pennsylvania, well, you know Cameron, he's a wild card. Anything could happen.
Looks like a two-horse race. So what's the next step for the rail splitter?
Well, it may look like that to you and me. It may look like that Stop Seward train is leaving the station with Lincoln as the engineer. But Lincoln's got to get the wigwam to understand that. So let's take a look at this first ballot. Seward's got 173, way short of 233. But what Lincoln's got to do is he's got to make sure that the favorite son candidates, William Dayton, Jacob Comer, steer their votes his way. He's got to also make sure that the people committed to him on that first ballot don't jump ship.
Marty, could you please explain to us the other factors that come into play here?
Yeah, you got to look at Ohio. Chase was supposed to take Ohio. I mean, he's supposed to be a major national candidate. But you have Benjamin Wade and John McClain splitting the delegation. Some of those Wade votes, he was supposed to come in as a favorite son, actually went to Lincoln. So that's a sign that Chase is really weak in his own state.
Why did Seward fail to lock it up on that very first ballot?
Well, first of all, Lincoln did his math. He knew he'd have to get to 100 to make himself look as a viable candidate, and that he'd have to take individual people from state delegations. But Seward also might have been a victim of what I call acclimation disease. I mean, he thought he had the thing wrapped up. He was in Europe for 9 months before the convention. He had nobody working for him on the floor. And you know what? It may go all the way back. It may go all the way back to those two famous lines that he just can't seem to escape. The irrepressible conflict and the higher law.
Let's play the cut from the SOS people. SOS, Stop Only Seward. Go to that negative ad cut.
This is Thurlow Weed, one of New York's finest. A big city deal-making machine politician. And this is his puppet, William Seward. Seward has spent the last 9 months living the fine life in Europe, drinking lattes while missing votes in Washington. Seward has spoken of an irrepressible conflict to defend a higher law. Do you want to go to war for a black Republican? Or is your higher law the Constitution? Stop Seward. Only Seward. Paid for by SOS and was not created in coordination with any campaign. Although that ad was technically an interest-oriented ad, you'll see the fingerprints of David Davis and Norman Judge all over it. Their strategy from the beginning has been to focus on Seward. Stop Seward. Only Seward. Well, let's compare it to this next ad.
Okay. So compare it to this ad.
When that telegram comes at 3 a.m. and that conflict has begun, who do you want reading it? Shouldn't it be someone who has met all the heads of state of Europe? Someone who has spent a lifetime cultivating relationships in the U.S. Senate? Someone who has taken a moral stance against slavery from day one? Or do you want a slick-talking, flip-flopping rail splitter whose entire federal resume consists of 1 2-year term in the House of Reps? In a time of crisis, you want a man of experience holding the wheel. I'm William Seward, and I approve this message.
How exactly did we get here? I mean, Lincoln wasn't even on anyone's radar as presidential timber until recently.
Well, I think after the Lincoln-Douglas debate, he became a celebrity in the party. But I'm thinking Lincoln first started this idea when he looked at the results of the election of 1856.
Look at that 56th election.
Okay, Mika, the key here are the swing states. States that Fremont lost, that the Republicans think they can pick up in 1860 if they have the right candidate. We're talking Pennsylvania, we're talking Indiana, we're talking Illinois, we're talking New Jersey. Now, the Republicans are still going to hold on to the Northeast. They're going to totally lose the South in 1860. They've given up on it. So they want someone who can secure these swing states. Now, take a look at the Know Nothing Party with Fillmore. The Republicans are courting some of the Know Nothings. But they can't run a candidate like Seward, who's come out for things like Catholic school education. These states, though, are not as simple as they look. The states of Indiana and Illinois are really two different states, northern and southern, and that breakdown has a lot to do with positions on slavery.
What are the problems for Seward and Chase in places like Indiana?
Well, if you look at the breakdown of the 56 election in more depth, you'll see that the states of Illinois and the states of Indiana are divided. You'll see these pockets of votes that went Know Nothing. So, the Republican Party has to find someone who can lock down Illinois and Indiana and still maintain the rest of the country.
Well, doesn't Lincoln have his own problem with the House divided speech?
Republicans need someone who can win the southern parts of Illinois and Indiana, steal it from Douglas, lock down the Know Nothings, who'll never go for a guy like Seward, and still maintain the anti-slavery Northeast. And that man's got to be Lincoln. These people don't trust a person like Seward or Chase. They trust Lincoln because he's one of them. But they also fear that the abolitionist positions that Chase and Seward have taken will cause a national referendum on abolition and maybe even cause black people to move up from the southern states.
Well, doesn't Lincoln have his own problem with the House divided speech? Let me play this cut for you.
Mr. President and gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. What I do expect, it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either
Well, Lincoln's been walking himself back from this speech for about 2 years now, and I think he's successfully pivoted. What he means by a house divided is that he's taking an absolute cold stone stance against popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is not a solution. And then add that, the Dred Scott case, he's trying to get people to understand that Dred Scott could mean a slippery slope of not only allowing slavery in the territories, but eventually allowing slavery in the actual free states. So what Lincoln's saying is that either the free state people are going to get stronger and limit this horrible institution to the place it exists, or the pro-slavery people are going to start to slowly chip away at the protections, and that this country will either go one way or the other. Lincoln has tried to make sure that people understand that that doesn't mean that he's going to try to bring about an end to slavery. He said as many times as people will hear that he has no intention to interfere in slavery with the states that it exists, but merely reiterates that the federal government has every constitutional right to keep it from spreading.
This is really the first presidential election where the Republican Party has a party apparatus. To many of our viewers, though, the party still lacks cohesion. Could you explain who exactly is in Chicago?
Okay, there's no quick answer to that. This Republican Party is an interesting collection of people, so let's give you a little historical perspective. You may say it started with the debacle of 1852. Right? You can see that the Whigs get absolutely whomped in this election. By this point, the Whigs had been stigmatized as the party of compromise. They had lost their leaders, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the big Whigs. And at this point, they're only holding on to a few small pockets in the country. But really, the next factor in this formation was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act, spontaneous combustion occurred. Not only were there many Whigs who jumped ship, but there were now a lot of Democrats who started to call themselves Nebraska Democrats because they couldn't support the idea of popular sovereignty. For a while, the people who were no longer Whigs, but certainly not Democrats, didn't really know what to call themselves. So they called themselves the Opposition Party. Samuel Galloway, a supporter of Lincoln, was a member of this opposition party in Ohio. The Opposition Party was a short-lived party that was a collection of independents, anti-know-nothings, fusions, anti-Nebraska people, anti-administration, Whig, Free Soil, Unionists, many of who were later to form the moderate wing of the Republican Party. Okay, now, you're going to see how the party grows through congressional elections. In 1852, you still have Whigs, right? And you have Democrats. Almost all the area that had been Whig had been replaced by Republicans, but they had lost a lot of ground to the Democrats. By 1858, though, as a result of the Dred Scott decision, as a result of Bleeding Kansas, as a result of the country starting to associate the Democratic Party with the slave party, the Republican Party is growing into a viable option. I think the formation of the Republican Party was more a confluence of circumstance and necessity rather than some grand plan. There were a lot of constituencies with no chair when the music stopped, so they ended up in this gumbo pot together. Politics may make strange bedfellows, but trying to explain how these boys got together is going to take some doing. The economic base of the party can be traced back to the old Federalist Whig economic standards of internal improvements, tariffs, a national bank. But when the Whigs lost the leadership of Clay and Webster, when they took a hit among the anti-slavery activists after supporting the Compromise of 1850, they imploded. I think this was a long time coming because demographically they were doomed when the country was starting to expand westward.
So who else is in this coalition? Let's take a look at those congressional election maps.
Well, if you want a real odd couple, you got the know-nothings who have a hate on the Irish Democrats in New York, plus they're not so crazy about the Germans in the Midwest. And then you got the Germans who are free soilers.
Free soil?
Yeah, it's the concept that the key to American democracy is available land. But that if that available land is occupied by slave owners, then free farmers, small yeoman farmers, the Jeffersonian farmers will never be able to compete. Free soil is what enabled Lincoln to become Lincoln. Free soil is the idea that you got to close off the territories to expansion of slavery, not necessarily because you're a Negro rights lover or an abolitionist, but because you want to reserve those lands for white economic development.
Anyone else?
Sure, they're the Nebraska Democrats. People like David Wilmot of Pennsylvania. I mean, he became a little nervous with the Democratic Party all the way back in 1848 when he wrote the Wilmot Proviso about the Mexican-American War. But Nebraska Democrats are people who jumped off the Democratic Party, mainly in places like Pennsylvania, when they started to realize that the Democratic Party was no longer a national party, that the Democratic Party was becoming the party of slavery.
Sounds like there are a lot of people to please.
More importantly, there are a lot of people to offend, and Lincoln's been really careful about that. Let me show you this letter to Samuel Galloway that represents that. This is Lincoln. My name is new in the field. I suppose I am not the first choice of a great many. Our policy, then, is to give no offense to others. Leave them in the mood to come to us if they shall be compelled to give up their first love. This, too, is dealing justly with all, and leaving us in the mood to support heartily whoever shall be nominated. Well, this was the key to Lincoln's strategy. For the last 2 years, he's been on a speaking tour, but not as a candidate, as a party spokesman. I call it his Trojan horse strategy. He goes to places like Wisconsin and talks about free soil. He goes to places like Boston and talks against the know-nothings. He's been giving speech after speech after speech, outlining his policies. The Republican platform, and this could have come out of one of the many, many speeches that Lincoln made. He actually traveled 4,000 miles during those 2 years. That he has no intention of interfering with slavery in the states that he exists. That he doesn't think he has the constitutional right to do so. This was first announced in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That the founders clearly set a standard that the federal government has the right to control slavery in the territories when they passed the Northwest Ordinance. Well, with that, Lincoln was trying to actually say to Douglas that if the founders had wanted popular sovereignty, they would have allowed popular sovereignty in the Northwest Territories. Instead, they clearly voted to outlaw slavery in the only area that the federal government had the authority over. So by appealing to the idea of the founders, Lincoln's trying to position the Republican Party as actually the conservative party, the party that believes in the ideas of the founding fathers, and not the radical party. And what he's saying is that there is no question that the federal government does have the authority to limit slavery in the territories. That the founders had believed in that if the founders had believed in popular sovereignty, they would have let the people of the territories decide, but they clearly didn't do that. That the Dred Scott case may open up a slippery slope. That if a slave is considered property, then why can that property not be taken into a free state? And that the only answer to this is to elect a Supreme Court that will understand that the Dred Scott case is on shaky constitutional ground. That although the fugitive slave law is abhorrent, it is the law, and the law must be respected. Lincoln is a legalist. He's a pragmatist. He understands that the law must be respected, or else he's going to be seen as a radical. Chase, Seward, they've come out against the Fugitive Slave Act, and this has scared people in the border states. Lincoln's not going to go there. The Republican Party does not believe in lawlessness, and that John Brown was no Republican. Free soil means upward mobility and a chance for a life that Lincoln himself has exemplified.
So how did we get to Chicago?
Well, that's an interesting story. Norman Judd was selected to go to New York, where they were going to decide where the convention was going to be held. And Judd convinced the people in New York that Chicago would be neutral territory. Chicago, 1850, it was a cow town, 25,000 people. But now in 1860, it's got over 100,000 people. It's the capital of the New West. It's got a train hub. It's got hotel space. Probably has a prostitute for every delegate. And Judd has decided that the proposals of St. Louis, the proposals of Cleveland, the proposals of Pennsylvania, he convinced the delegation that those were all home fields for the favorite sons. What an irony. Lincoln was not on anyone's radar, so Chicago was seen as neutral. So now we have the convention here in Chicago. And not only is it in Chicago, but Norman Judd arranged train fares to drop down to next to nothing so that Lincoln people could come from all over Illinois and flood the wigwam.
Is Lincoln himself there?
Well, no, he's not. But this one I got to quote Lincoln himself. He said, he's too much of a candidate to be there, but not enough of a candidate to not be there. Classic Lincoln.
So, how did Lincoln even become a candidate?
Well, it started with a letter from Jesse Fell. Lincoln was in a deep depression after his loss to Douglas, and Fell recommended that Lincoln might be presidential timber. Lincoln dismissed it out of hand. But then Lincoln went to the Illinois Convention, that was going to select maybe a favorite son for Illinois, considering that Illinois was a swing state. And he's sitting around with Norman Judd and David Davis and Leonard Swett, and he says, well, what about me? And they all thought it was one of Lincoln's jokes. And then he said, well, what about me?
What were his strategies to bring this about?
Well, his strategies was to be a non-candidate candidate. His strategy was to be the party spokesman. But his strategy also was to identify that Seward, Chase, Bates all had fatal flaws and were not electable, and that Lincoln never entered into this race as anyone's first choice. He was dependent on what would be today called a brokered convention.
What do you think has led to the collapse of Seward?
Well, Seward's credit has to be given to him for his stance on slavery. He came out in Cleveland in 1850 talking about that Negroes should have rights to be witnesses in trials, that they should have rights to voting, that they should have rights to schooling. He came out that Catholics in New York should be able to have their own parochial schools. He's always been a man of principle. He's been a man of education. He's been a dignified politician. But this is just not his time. Maybe it's his connections to Thurlow Weed. Maybe it's the fact that the irrepressible conflict and the higher law quotes he can't escape from. But most importantly, he never set up a strategy. He expected the election to come to him, and it just didn't.
When did Chase become a non-factor?
Well, Chase had some problems going all the way back to the 1850s. Chase had started the Liberty Party in Ohio, and by doing that, he alienated a lot of the old-time Whigs who haven't forgotten 1860. But Chase's biggest problem is nobody likes the guy. He's one of those people who loves mankind but hates people. I mean, as a school teacher, he was known for whipping people, and I think he's brought his whip to Chicago in 1860. But the biggest thing is that Chase liked to think of himself as being the number one guy in terms of being anti-slavery, that he had defended against the fugitive slave law in the Matilda case, and that was his claim to fame. And Seward stole his thunder on being the party's leader against slavery, so there was really no place for Chase to go. Chase was a non-factor. But in Chase's own mind, he was still presidential timber.
We heard that there was even talk in '58 of Douglas being a Republican.
Yeah, Douglas is a politician. He's a deal maker. He always thinks that there was just one more deal to be made, and he thought maybe if he could lock up the Republican nomination that he could win the election. Lincoln saw that coming. And in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln paints him into the Freeport Doctrine. And then that enables Lincoln to take a stand on popular sovereignty. That popular sovereignty was the bottom line, and thus forced Douglas to take the Democratic nomination. Mika, I'm hearing something. Hold on a second. A deal's been worked out for Pennsylvania. All of Pennsylvania's delegates are going to Lincoln on the second ballot. There must have been something worked out with Cameron because he's not just doing this for the good of the party.
A deal?
Yeah, despite the fact that Lincoln had given strict instructions to his men, make no promises that bind me, Cameron is too ripe for the picking. Boy, would I love to know what was promised down on that floor. Well,
sounds like the corrupt bargain redo.
Yeah, well, Henry Clay would have appreciated it. But let's see. We have a quote from one of the Cameron people from Pennsylvania. So let's go to that. Lincoln told me, this is Cameron speaking, or Cameron's people, Lincoln told me that he was more indebted to Judd than any other man for his nomination. And I told him that I thought Davis and Swett did more for them. They bought my men, Casey and Sanderson, and the rest of them. I was for Seward. I knew I couldn't be nominated, but I wanted a complimentary vote from my own state. But David and the rest stole all my men. So we'll have to wait till after the convention to find out what really happened on the floor of the wigwam.
Do you think he will have to do the same in Ohio?
No, Ohio is imploding as we speak. Chase doesn't have the same command over the Ohio delegation that Cameron had over Pennsylvania. And Ohio's delegation is actually swinging over to Lincoln. The way the wigwam is set up is that Seward's people are all the way on one side of the wigwam, and the people from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio are all the way on the other. And there literally there's no communication. So Seward can't get to the people from Ohio, so I think it's pretty confident that they're going to go over.
Okay, we are getting ready for the second ballot. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, the bombshell that Pennsylvania is throwing support is that Pennsylvania is throwing support to Lincoln. So is Vermont. Ohio is on its way. Seward is actually gaining votes. But without Cameron in the picture, Lincoln is gaining momentum. And Lincoln is emerging as the only anti-Seward candidate.
Marty, are you hearing anything yet about the third ballot?
Yeah, exciting things are happening. 20 delegates from Ohio have switched to Lincoln. All of the favorite sons are dropping out. Hold on, we're getting word. It's happened. Lincoln has got the nomination in one of the most improbable rises in American political history. A two-time Senate loser, a one-term congressman, a rail splitter has won the Republican nomination.
What brought Lincoln the victory?
Well, let's look at the final ballot. You can see from the first ballot to the second ballot, Lincoln picked up Pennsylvania and then assorted other miscellaneous delegates. Ohio was still staying with Chase, but they had lost 7 key delegates. By the third ballot, all these other people had gone into the Lincoln camp, pushing him way over what was needed. In the end, it was a perfect storm. Everything had to fall in place from the start. Lincoln knew he was few people's first choice. What he had to do was make it viable that he was an acceptable second choice. He also had to keep his name off VP ballots, and he had to keep building momentum, keep his name viable. Maybe if Seward had campaigned, maybe if Chase had held things together in Ohio, but they didn't. More importantly, Lincoln strategized this nomination for the last 2 years while the others were waiting for it to come to them. A bunch of things had to all fall into place, but in the end, Lincoln represented the National Republican Party platform, a hybrid of Whig economic policy, firm anti-popular sovereignty, caution on Negro rights, recognition of immigrants, and the conversion from the perception of being radicals on slavery to the position of being constitutional conservatives who represented the founders. In the end, Lincoln was the only candidate who could pull these strangest of bedfellows together. He appeals to the anti-Nebraska Democrats, the conscience Whigs, the know-nothings, the immigrants, the standard Whigs. He was no one's first choice, but the boys from Illinois that put this vision together knew that he could be everybody's second choice.
So, Marty, is there anything else going on?
We're hearing reports that there are protesters in Grant Park and that Mayor Daley has authorized the Chicago police to beat them up, to tear gas them, to employ Gestapo tactics. JK, wait 100 years.